Good morning. My name is Erica Woodford. I'm the Clerk of Superior Court of Bibb County, Georgia, and I would like to welcome you all this morning to Racial Impact Assessment, a practical approach and solutions to reduce racial and ethnic disparities in the justice system. So if you all will get ready to be comfortable with uncomfortable topics so that we can all grow. This course is live streamed, so welcome to our virtual attendees this morning. Welcome to our actual attendees. If you all will kindly use the app, you can go into the session in the app and use the chat. So for those of you who are attending virtually, you can use the chat to post your questions or comments. Those of you present, you can also use the chat, or you can use one of the microphones if you would kindly raise your hand and be acknowledged by our speaker. Also, course materials are found in the app under the session. And if you need continuing legal education or continuing education, you can find that form on the NACM.net app. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning, Mr. Michael Roosevelt. He is the co-chair of the Diversity, Access, and Fairness Subcommittee and former chair of the Education Committee for the National Association of State Judicial Educators. Not only did he develop curriculum, but he also teaches courses on diversity, fairness, and implicit bias. So he can teach us a lot today, things that we can take home to our respective courts and jurisdictions to better enhance the justice system. Mr. Roosevelt has also piloted the Racial Impact Assessment tool to address racial disparities. He has received high honors and recognition as a judicial educator and for his numerous years of service. One fun fact is that he is the grandfather of 11. So I present to you all Mr. Michael Roosevelt.
I am delighted to be able to spend some time with you away from 11 grandchildren. Actually, my wife is in Atlanta, Georgia right now. The 11th one was delivered 3 days ago. He is healthy. He has my good looks. So he's going to go a long way. And so we're going to have an interactive dialogue. And this is an important conversation to really look deeply at the issue of race and how race really can infect or can infuse the work that we do. And so the work that we're going to do today is not going to be just me talking, but I'm going to ask you to do something. You're going to actually practice using a tool called the Racial Impact Assessment tool. Because my belief is that if you don't put your hands on it, you can't get dirty, right? So we want to get you right in there in some very, very practical ways. So let's get started. We all make decisions. Humans by nature really run on input and data. We pull in information from all over the place. Actually, right now, you're taking in millions and millions of bits of piece of information. The question becomes, what do you do with that? What are your decisions? What are your outputs? Your decisions have some consequences, so you make these decisions. But our decisions that we make are infused by our backgrounds, by our culture, by our experiences. Those are the things that really sort of shape how we make decisions. Even though we may not be aware of it, those factors come into our decision making. But in line with that decision-making process, we also have this thing called implicit bias. Many of you have had discussions about implicit bias in terms of what it is, how it's defined, but our decision-making that we make every day outside of our awareness is also impacted by implicit bias or our implicit biases. So when we think about decision-making, we think about decision-making bias. Let me ask in this room, like a nice group, anyone here has no bias? Okay, good. I was just checking. It's a temperature check. I just wanted to make sure. But we have what we call decision-making biases. And there are a lot of different kinds of biases. There's one called confirmation bias, where we look for things to support our own belief. That we don't look further than that. We're like, that's what I believe about those people. Confirmed, right? And so we make these decisions often unaware. Some of us make decisions about where our children go to school, where we live, right? Who we live with, right? We make decisions. And those decisions are influenced by a lot of factors. Implicit bias, this is a quick definition. Basically, implicit biases are those unconscious, automatic assumptions that we make that are outside of our awareness. No matter how smart we are, how many degrees we have, how many grandchildren we have, these biases are outside of our awareness. And they happen fairly quickly. Biases can be slow-moving, but they often happen in a millisecond. So when you walked into this room, what did you notice about me? Male, handsome, thank you. Male, African American, at least phenotypically, right? Based on my skin color and my look. My approximate age, 27. Correct. Right, correct. You would be right on all those points. But you automatically, without even knowing it, made some assumptions about me. Now, what is interesting about that, my race, my height, my gender, and my age really mean very little. It's what you do with those things that we really have a discussion about. The racial impact assessment tool is a way for us to mediate the influence of biases in our decision making. So when we've been talking about implicit bias, we've been talking about sort of how the brain works. But what's been limited about the discussion is what practical tools can you use to mediate the influence of your implicit biases. See, that is the key. But we can talk about implicit bias, but we have to have something that we can use to mediate the influence of our decision making. So it is really a process, a systematic process by which we engage to look at policies and practices that we either have in place or might be considering to put in place to identify whether or not there might be a disparate impact on one group or another. There are some clear benefits to having an RIA or a racial impact assessment tool, sometimes called a racial equity assessment tool, or it could be called a racial audit system, whatever you decide to call it. But it really engages us in a really, I think, important conversation. It identifies potential adverse impacts of our decisions, things that we don't know we're making a good decision, but we're not aware of its perhaps adverse impact. It really involves a greater openness about public policy making decisions. That is, when we engage in a racial impact assessment, we really are about more transparency. You see, so a lot of times people think decisions are made in the boardroom, right? But when you engage in the racial impact assessment, you really are inviting others to really weigh in on your decision-making process. It really will enhance our ability to serve all groups that come into the courts, that interface with the justice system. And finally, this is really critical. The National Center for State Courts has done a considerable amount of work on raising the level of public trust and confidence in our justice system. The work has been amazing, but the frustration is it hasn't really elevated. In other words, African Americans still don't have a high trust in the justice system. All the great research has not really moved the number significantly to show that certain racial and ethnic groups do not feel as confident in our justice system. And we think the racial impact assessment tool can raise the level of confidence in our justice system. So, when you make decisions in different ways. We sometimes call them decision points. That along the way of making a decision, there are different points in the decision-making process where we can say, A, B, C, D. These are different points in the decision-making process. Some people like, I'm making my decision from A to D, and I'm sticking with it. I got to move fast. I got to make a decision. I can't wait. Others go A, B, C. Let me pause on C. That's a decision point we need to analyze. That's a decision point we need to really think about before we go on to the next step. Does that make sense? So the idea of a decision-making point is to look at each point in the process of making a decision, and at different points you may slow down the process, you might go back, you might skip forward, but there's a process that you engage in. We call those decision points. Leaders here. How many of you have, since COVID and before COVID, had to make some critical decisions in your court? Yeah, some very critical decisions. How many of you would admit that sometimes you know what you were doing? God bless you. You're in my church now, amen? But we make these decisions sometimes based on the best information that we have. But then on reflection, we say, oh, if I had known that, if I had known this, I would have made a different decision. I could have gotten off that ramp to make a different decision. Let me talk about possible applications. I'm going to talk about just one or two. I'm going to use the example of a court. This court had decided to build a brand new spanking courthouse. Oh, and it's gorgeous. I mean, it's state of the arts, spent millions of dollars on the courthouse. And this is in a city that is largely, where the courthouse was built, a largely white suburban community because they needed a courthouse. The adjacent community 30 miles away, where all the arraignments were held, where most of the population who end up in the criminal justice system go, and where oftentimes they're housed pre-trial, the court decided, we have a brand new courthouse, we need to fill it up. We need to have people in the courthouse, court users. And so what they decided to do was move all of the hearings from 30 miles away. I'm going to call it in the hood. I'm using that, colloquial. They moved it from one point to a suburban area. Now, that was a fiscal decision because they built a new courthouse. They have to have staffing it, and they thought moving it there. They made a decision. Immediately, the public defender said, there's a problem. What do you think the problem is going to be? They can't get there. Their families can't get to that city 30 miles away. The presiding judge decided that we're going to go ahead and move anyway because we have made a decision. I made a decision. I'm not going to revisit the points of my decision making. I'm moving forward. This will have a disparate impact on African Americans and Latinos, moms, dads, and children who wanted to go to a hearing. They couldn't get there. And this was interesting. It requires a car to get there. If you're taking public transportation, it will take you about 2.4 hours to get there. And once you got there on that thing called BART, you have to take a cab or an Uber to the courthouse. So this will have a disparate racial impact. The court went ahead and moved. When they said it hit the fan, the media got it, and all of a sudden the court reversed its decision. It became enlightened about the decision point and decided that, oh no, we're no longer going to do that. We're going to have them all back where they should have been held in the first point. And so what I'm getting at, if there was a racial impact assessment tool guiding that decision, he or she, the presiding judge and the court executive, might have off-ramped before they went to implementation. That's the power of having a tool that can guide your decision and, in some ways, remove your biases from the decision-making process. And so that's one case. So we're going to get right to it. You have a handout that is a racial impact assessment tool. I'm going to go through parts. You can follow along with me, but it's not so critical because I got it here, but I want you to open up that documentation. The racial impact assessment tool in 3 parts. We're only going to focus on 3 parts today. It's actually a 5-part tool. We're only going to focus on just 3 of those sections. We're going to focus on the project details. This is a core part of when you begin to use the tool, a set of questions you want to ask and be able to answer. Then we're going to go to part 3, which is determining what impact that decision could make on whatever problem or issue you're trying to address. And then the last one is you make recommendations based on all 4. So the racial impact assessment tool is divided into these parts. So the first part is project details. We basically asked you to complete this section, describe what the proposed action is going to be. What's the action? Sometimes by writing down the action, you get clarity on what the action is going to be. Right? The second part is you're going to describe what the proposed action or project, including what the problem is going to be. You're going to describe what that is. The third part is that you're going to describe the target population. Who might be impacted by that decision? That's an important element of the decision-making process. You're going to get demographic information. You're going to get target population selected. You're going to get all this other information. You're going to collect that in that early stage. And then you're going to say, what are your proposed or intended actions? Now, these are your good intentions. You never act in a way that's not good. You're always thinking about what's going to best serve the public. But you're going to think about what is the intended outcome. Part 3. And part 3 is the critical. You're going to determine the impact on specific racial or ethnic populations. So we're talking about race here. You could adapt this tool to focus on other issues. Could be language, right? Could be gender. But we're talking about race here. What adverse impact or unintended consequences could arise by the proposed action? Building a courthouse and making people come there that live 30 miles away, right? Is there a disparate or racial impact? This is particularly important. How do you know there will be a disparate impact? Is there data? Is there information that you need to collect in order to make that determination? Can these racial impacts contribute to systemic disparities and disproportionality? And then finally, for part 3, what specific racial impacts can be identified? In some cases, sentencing disparities, removal of children, access to services. These are other elements that we might want to consider. And then this is critical. At the end of the assessment, you make recommendations. And recommendations are critical to your next step, which is to take some action. And sometimes it might result in significant change, minor change, but you want to have a rationale for your actions. And you want to detail recommendations for changes or what the next steps are going to be. So we just marched you to 3 sections of the racial impact assessment tool. And it's made to be user-friendly. And it's a fillable form, so you don't have to figure out how to get things aligned like I do. So it's pretty accessible and pretty easy to use. So we went through part 1, you went through part 3, and part 5. So right now, I want you to think about a policy, a proposal, new law, which your RIA analysis might be useful before adoption or implementation. Think about a policy, rule, new law that might impact you. So in California, for example, we have a new law that requires judges to look at peremptory challenges differently, and particularly align with the issue of race, because we now know that more African Americans and more people of color get excluded from juries. And oftentimes it has to do with their race, although it's not stated. And so we have a new peremptory challenge rule that limits the number of peremptory challenges, right, on the part of both attorneys. And it provides that judges have to do, the court has to do an analysis as well if there are racial disparities in who gets selected on a jury. So I want you to think about a policy that in your local area, in your court, in your jurisdiction, or a new law that's happened. So we're going to get you to practice. Are you ready? Are you ready? All right. So to get you to practice, we're going to have you work in kind of like teams. And your groups are pretty good. So if you are sitting at a table by yourself and you feel really lonely, join a group, all right? And so what we want you to do is step one is right now I want you to kind of say hi to your neighbor. Hi, neighbor. And also say, we're going to be working together. In the morning. All right, very good. We're going to be working together. All right, so pull in closer. So right now, come on. You're awesome. Come on over. Join that group. You want to? Now, let me have a show of hands, or if you're in a group. You're just in a group. If you feel lonely again, come and join one else. Great. Now, I want you to select someone who's going to be your recorder. Someone who's going to be your recorder or scribe, and someone who's going to be the reporter. So right now, select that person. Awesome. All right. Show of hands. Show of hands. Okay, you have a reporter? Great. Next step. I want you to now decide, and I'm going to give you approximately 5 minutes because rumor had that you guys are like a super brilliant group. So I want you to come up with an issue, a burning issue in one of your jurisdictions that has to deal with race or might have an adverse racial impact. I want you to think in your group, is there an issue in your jurisdiction? So take a moment to pause, think about your jurisdiction, where you are in your state, where you are in your county, whether you're rural, urban, big city, small city. I want you to think about that. So what is a burning issue? So I'll give you an example of an issue. I gave you the courthouse construction one. I'm going to give you another one. This is an issue around whether or not we can continue doing implicit bias training in our state courts because there are legislators who are saying they won't fund the state if you continue to do implicit bias or bias education. Any states like that in here? Florida is one. Georgia is another. They've already passed it. So the question is, that's a real burning issue in jurisdictions. Got it. So think about the issue, discuss among yourselves, 5 minutes, starting now. Now. So what I want to do is hear from different groups. Now, we will not be able to get to every group, We're going to do the best we can, so don't feel slighted if we don't get to you. But before we get to you, I want to mention a few things. There have been states that have actually adopted racial impact assessment tools. They put it in legislation, and it's required that every program that, even for writing grants, there has to be a racial impact assessment before they issue out RFPs. They've looked at decision-making as like legislation. If new legislation is going to happen, they have to use a racial impact assessment tool or a racial equity tool. So in Washington State, they've adopted it. There have been other states. Iowa has adopted the racial impact assessment. I know, she said, Iowa? Yes, Iowa has adopted a racial impact assessment tool. I actually talked to the legislator who actually wrote the legislation. And he is now going around the country trying to convince governments to actually adopt a racial impact assessment tool in doing government business. And so this tool has actually expanded, and I think there's going to be more expansion, but it's going to be a slow road to get there. So it's not going to be a fast road. So because we have people who are actually tuning in, I'm going to ask you to come to the microphone so we can actually capture what you're saying and it can be heard. So get ready with your mic voice, all right? So I'm going to randomly call on groups because I find that works best. I'm going to call on group number 1. I'm going to call on your group. Come on up and report.
I'll bet I can be heard without a mic.
I bet you can. I bet you can. So I want you to talk about what did you, a little bit about the project detail, what the project is, what possible impact, and maybe 1 or 2 recommendations that you came up with.
Okay, the project would be to eliminate the statute and the court rule that allows a challenge for cause from jury service based upon a prior felony conviction. The impact is on those groups which are disproportionately convicted of crime and disproportionately excluded from jurors. That would be, in our state, substantially African Americans, most particularly men. The potential adverse unintended consequence was that, more likely than not, voir dire will take longer. Other than that, the exclusions could be, that would be because you'd have to go beyond just the mere felon conviction and ascertain some basis that this particular person was biased. We looked at, you've got the notes, I'm just trying to remember. We do believe that the impact should be to expand our jury pool, to improve public confidence in its courts. We understood that potentially there may be an argument made in criminal cases. Okay, there may be a potential argument in criminal cases, and to that end, we considered a recommendation to modify the statute and the court rule as to civil cases first.
Thank you.
Did I miss anything? Okay.
So if I stop near you, that's you, okay? Hi, it's you.
So we talked. Okay, so we talked about some legislation that passed in Nevada that specifically is addressing bail hearings and how quickly they're supposed to be held. So the intent of the legislation was to even the playing field regardless of someone's financial circumstances, but the unintended consequences are that the expedited manner that they have to be held now is going to make it even harder, I fear, for individuals who have limited financial resources to get released. So a couple recommendations that we had were to look at perhaps having court rules that we could try and balance out the legislation. And then there was also a recommendation, maybe we could just call the legislature back to special session and have them like go through this, because I don't think they did.
Come on up, my next group. Yeah.
Well, this is pretty interesting because we're a pretty diverse group ourselves. I'm not even in a courthouse or a court district. I'm a court reporter, which made me the natural for reporting, recording the proceedings, right?
Perfect.
And so our group is, we took an issue in a largely homogeneous white district of pretrial juvenile detention and applied it with the rest of our group, and because they're highly intelligent people and they can do this fusion, to a more dense population in Atlanta, right? And so, yeah, the issue is pretrial juvenile detention, and so the issue was applied to a lower socioeconomic group of detainees. You know, court reporters don't like to talk. So the issue is the lengthy detaining of juveniles without bond, and the pretrial conditions, especially when you have an overlay of domestic violence issues potentially at home. And combining my fear of speaking with aged eyes, this is making it difficult. So. I'm having trouble here. But no, not this handwriting, you can't. So, so the issue, much better speaking here. Go ahead. Oh, no, you can't read this. You can't read those.
So I believe our issue was juveniles in detention, and the key considerations were services when they were actually let out. A lot of our juveniles are let out without actual services, so we're trying to make sure that they get the appropriate services after actual detention. The recommendations was to make sure that they had the appropriate services upon release, and to make sure that we were actually treating the underlying issues and not just putting a Band-Aid on the actual problem.
Thank you.
Yeah, because the potential problems came up as, you know, are we treating this with a Band-Aid? Are we releasing them to get in trouble again? And yeah, that type of thing. So thank you very much, Gary, for the help.
Hi. Yes. Oh, God. Yes. Hi. All right. There we go. You want to hold the mic versus?
So our issue is the racial disparity in upper management in our courts in Washington State. It's predominantly all white women that that are court administrators in our state. And so, so what we determined, the impact for racial and ethnic populations, is that we have to focus on or eliminate barriers to high salaried employment opportunities for people of color. And in our courts, we only have maybe 3 men that run our courts. So, so we love to come to NACM to see the diversity, because we don't have that in Washington State. And for the purpose of really improving the public's trust and confidence in our courts, what we have found is that when people see people that they can relate to, they feel like they are getting the truth from the courts. That's the reality. So we have to change the upper management, as well as focus on
hiring a more diverse population from the ground up, and then putting things in place that will allow for that upward mobility in our courts. Why did you call on me? Yeah, you, Lillian. There you go.
Passing the baton. Thank you. So I'm Lillian Hawkins from Washington State. So we talked about a couple of things, and one of them is that we see that when we talk about equity and social justice, racial justice, that it is used or is seen as a political issue so that it is not addressed in our courts. And so the impact to that is that we don't talk about race. We don't talk about racial justice. And so what we need to do is we need to incorporate equity and social justice, racial justice, core competencies, tools and skills on how, sorry, I just ran back from the bathroom. Try not to come up here. So to incorporate tools and skills in mitigating bias, in eliminating biases in court practices, policies, procedures. We need managers, we need coordinators, we need skills to have courageous conversations so we can interrupt racism in our courts. And then also we need to be able to develop staff to have these core competencies. And that also means that we need to hire folks. So if we develop these core competencies and we hire folks that have these core competencies, then we'll be able to change the workforce, change the culture within our courts. So that's what we talked about, and then amongst a whole bunch of other stuff. So come on over to Washington.
And I want you to feel comfortable if you want somebody to stand with you to do that. I mean, this is not about a sole presenter needing to present, but I want to comment on what you talked about. A diverse court is sort of a cornerstone, right? A representative court. That's really about, one of our high-level things. We want fairness and access, right? We want diversity. But you can get it, but the key sometimes in our thinking is how to retain.
Right.
And what do you do to retain? And what do you do once you get them there to show them the pathways to leadership? And one way to do that, we think, is to develop mentor programs. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is actually to subsidize people's professional growth to get degrees. That's another thing you can do. And then I think what's also critical, and I think this is an important topic to me because I think that idea of retention, not just hiring, but then you have to really think clearly about who is actually on the panel. Right. Are they as committed as you are to the issue of diversity and fairness? So what is the makeup of the panel? It's a very complex issue. And then after all that, there has to be a degree of accountability. I'm a director, I'm a manager. Somebody has to hold me accountable whether I achieve these benchmarks. It's not enough to say, oh, we tried and we couldn't find any of them when they're just around the corner. And it had to be a degree of accountability. It's a very complex and delicate conversation, but I think it's an important one because public perception is shaped by who they see when they first come into the court, who they see on the bench, who they see in a criminal capacity, who's in front of them. So I think these are critical questions, so thank you for bringing that up. It's a complex issue. Yes?
I just had a thought. Like, our group went kind of everywhere because there's so many aspects of this. Hi. Okay. So one of the things that came up from Lillian was policies that keep our staff diverse within the workforce. And so we have some hiring policies that need to be checked that are barriers. But there's also internal policies that we didn't really get to talk about. But some of them are like in your union contracts or in your personnel policies. And I'll give you a great example. I went from a predominantly white area in Snohomish County to a very diverse area in downtown Seattle, and I was the coordinator there. And one of the policies that we talked about when we went through equity and social justice training was, personnel policies. Go through your personnel policies. Say you have a personnel policy that says if you have a pungent lunch, you cannot eat that lunch at your desk. My office had 3 individuals that were Indian within that office alone. So it's in every area of your hiring and your personnel. I mean, to really go through your entire organization, not just the frontline barrier of who gets in the door and who gets in the room to ask questions. It's in your questions, it's in your application process, it's in your hiring panel, it's in your person that's going through your policies. And then it for leadership, the executive branch, at least in that county, and I'm working with my executive branch and now back in Snohomish County, is who is your leadership and why does your leadership look the way it does? Sometimes you just need to punt and say, your leadership needs to have equity and social justice, and as the people the electeds that are hiring the leadership, it's up to you to figure out how to get that to that point. But this is your strategic plan. You don't get to say, well, nobody applied. No, you've been placed at that bar, now meet that bar. How are you going to meet that bar? That's really where the conversation needs to happen.
That's very powerful, and we could stick with this discussion about hiring. I want to go to my next group that's just looking right at me. They just can't wait to get up there, and that's right there. You just come on up. Oh, I'm going.
And as they come up,
I'm
Norman from the virtual environment said that the DEI bonus sessions are really on point for discussion. Might want to refer folks to them as resources to access and follow up the DEI bonus sessions. I don't know what DEI is.
Equity, inclusion.
Thank you. And he responded, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
We focused on a very small, narrow topic that's being discussed right now in our court, which is should mugshots be removed from pretrial assessment reports? It's the only photograph that we typically have in our court file, but it's also the document that the judge is looking at when they're making a release decision at the time of arraignment. And so it's an active discussion that's happening right now. And our recommendation in the end is yes, they should probably be removed. But there's probably going to be some pushback from, some of the folks who maybe rely on those photos to recognize an individual downstream if it's a judge that supervises that person on probation, or maybe the pretrial officers that supervise folks on pretrial release. But overall, the removal of that bias that may come into play with a judge looking at that picture and making a release decision is worth it. So that was the end result.
I see a hand over there, please.
It's an interesting topic because
Bring the mic over. Thank you.
The past job, I was the chief probation officer, and part of the job there is review violation of probation, reports that come to you. And I consciously would try to not look at the name. I would consciously try to not even know if the person is male or female, because you want to just look at the facts of what's going on and how they're performing and react to that. But then you also kind of wonder, well, do you want to give a break to a certain group or not? Like, it's kind of a tough area. Like, do you put that in or do you not put it in? But at the end of it, you really want to just look at their actions and make sure you're going from you did this, I got it. We're gonna violate you, but it's a tough one.
It's a tough one. We have about 2 more minutes left, so I want to be mindful of time. You want to say something? I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
And the judge is no different pre-trial release. You usually see the people on video or in person, so I don't see the issue there. The issue is not whether you see them, is do you see them? Because you can't really address equity.
Yes.
Yeah, you can address equality by just looking at the data, but you can't address equity without knowing about people and their trauma and who they are, everything that makes them.
Yeah. We are closing in on our time. We have 3 minutes left. I wanted to make sure that I didn't slight my group who didn't want to talk. So I'm going to call them up. Come on up. You don't have time? No, I made time for you guys. Come on
3
up.
3 minutes.
Because they said, he's not going to get to us. So I'm not ready.
Let's do it together. Well,
theirs was an interesting issue, so it's a complex issue, so go ahead.
and it didn't, we're from, well, most of us, 3 of us are from Georgia. and we did address the voter suppression bill, and the adverse racial impact, because that bill has passed in Georgia. So the some of the intended consequences is to reduce the number of precincts, increase identification, to change voter laws to affect people of color, seniors, that demographic group, to doing so by selected data of voter turnout and data of voter results, making it difficult for all by cutting services. So the intended outcome is based on changing election outcomes to ensure that one party will not win an election. There were some, also the law was put in place to address fraud and security, none of which existed prior to this last election cycle. But some of the unintended consequences of this law is that while it has restricted access to voting for one demographic, it has actually reduced it for all people in Georgia, especially given last year in a pandemic. So, and since we don't have a lot of, this is complex and we have a lot. And so, before I just end on what we are proposing, is there anything else? It's to completely repeal this bill. And one of the other unintended, which is a big one and could affect everybody, the other unintended consequence as a result of this bill is that the state of Georgia is being sued by the Department of Justice on this bill. Yes.
And I think the legislation, the changes impact who becomes judges.
And that, exactly.
It impacts the laws that are made, either more punitive laws, more restrictive laws, more draconian laws. It has real impact. So I think sometimes you have to think about, when I think about the court in California, there's a relationship with the executive branch and the judicial branch. There is a relationship between those two. We often don't want to say there is one, but there's a strong relationship between the two. And they're often in communication with each other, right? And in California, we were hoping for a certain governor, because we would know the relationship with that governor might be able to allow certain bills to pass that could actually fund the courts more, provide more services. So these are really issues. First of all, I know our time is up. I want to thank you for just going in with me and playing around with this tool and experimenting with this tool. I think it's a practical tool. It's something that you can actually use and you can adapt and you can shape it in a way that meets your needs. I will also make available to you the instructional guide. There's also an instructional guide that goes with it. It's fairly clearly written, and it's no more than 10 pages, and it kind of walks you through each piece in more detail, and it gives you an opportunity to kind of think about how you might want to use this tool. You've been absolutely wonderful, so thank you so much for your time and attention. I really enjoyed it.